Right, we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar, Slavery in New England. My name is Brittany Garrett, and I am the Collections and Research Public Programming Specialist here at Old Sturbridge Village. And tonight we will be discussing the institution of slavery in New England and how it played an important role in shaping the region's economy and society. So this important topic will be led by the Collections and Research Department's newest member, Dr. CJ Martin. CJ is a research historian at Old Sturbridge Village, and he also teaches courses in all phases of the long Black freedom struggle at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Emerson College, and the Rhode Island School of Design. His forthcoming book, currently in peer review, is entitled Our Earnest Remonstrance, Race, Citizenship, and Voting Rights in New England, 1770 to 1843. He has written articles published in the Rhode Island History Journal, Commonplace, and several public history sites. His research more broadly examines the voices of Black New Englanders in the early Republic and the role they played in the abolitionist movement and shaping the politics of the era. We are all very excited to have him join our team and to share his knowledge with us. So welcome, CJ. Before I hand things over to you, CJ, I have a few technical things to share. So this program is being recorded and it will be posted on the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page in case you miss any part of it or you want to share it with others. There will also be a question and answer session following the discussion tonight. So I invite you to leave your questions at any point during the presentation in the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom center of your screen. And that is all from me. So I will pass things over to CJ now.
All right, thank you, Brittany, and everyone can hear me, right? Is that right, Brittany? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. Appreciate you all taking the time. If I'm joining you at the dinner table or in your living room or in your office, what have you, thank you for kind of inviting me into your home tonight. Yeah, so just to kind of get started. When I was asked to do a webinar about slavery in New England, it's a really broad topic. There's a lot of research that's been done on slavery in New England. So what I kind of decided to do tonight was to turn this into like an introduction to slavery in New England. I know everybody at home is probably at all different levels of understanding of slavery in New England. Some of you may know a lot about it and have read multiple books about it. Some may not really know much. So if you don't know much about it, this will be hopefully a really good introduction. You'll learn a lot. And even if you do know a lot about it, hopefully, this can kind of reframe your understanding or maybe even, hopefully enhance your perspective on this really important topic. So first, before I get started, I just want to, go over some main takeaways, I think, that I hope you'll all get from this. My first takeaway is that slavery and enslaved people were important to the development of New England, vitally important to the development of New England. And I mean the development of New England broadly, not just in the colonial era, not just in the early Republic or even the 19th century, right up until today. Right. I mean, we saw this morning there was a decision made in the Supreme Court, right, that has its roots, right, in slavery in the in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So it's important, I think, to understand what slavery was here in New England. Also, another important takeaway: New England slavery, as it was in the South, was human trafficking, and it relied on unceasing violence and torture to be maintained. Okay. And I say that because I think this is me doing a little bit of myth busting here. I think there is a sense maybe among some New Englanders that slavery wasn't as bad or was a little different. And I should say it was a little different, but I want to dispel the myth that maybe it wasn't as bad as it was in the South, right? But I want us to all understand it was human trafficking, and it relied on unceasing violence and torture, or at least the threat of violence and torture. Okay, that's an important piece to note here. And also important, enslaved New Englanders always contested their enslavement. Okay, and I'm not going to really get into too much of it tonight, but there were many different ways people contested slavery. A lot of it in New England would be like quotidian resistance, as a lot of historians like to say, or just everyday forms of resistance, tool breaking, work slowdowns, absconding, so like running away temporarily until a situation was rectified, etc. But also involved in this contestation of enslavement is the fact that enslaved people affirmed their humanities in myriad ways. Okay, and we'll get into some of those tonight. And also, it's important to know, important to understand that enslaved people led the drive to emancipate themselves. Right, enslaved people were the leaders of the various movements that ended slavery in New England and across the country, of course. So, in order to start, I know this seems kind of weird, CJ, we're talking about New England, but I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of wider context into which New England slavery fit. And as historians, we kind of, when we're talking about the colonial era, right, the era before the American Revolution, we kind of break what British North America will become the United States into three major regions. One would be New England, but another one is the Chesapeake, okay, the Chesapeake Bay area. And what we mean by that usually is, Virginia and Maryland. And we normally include, especially like Northern North Carolina in this, because they shared a very similar economic system as Virginia and Maryland. And what's important to understand about slavery and the development of this region is that this region was really developed specifically to be, money-making enterprises with the chief crop during the colonial era, tobacco, right? So it was really developed as a tobacco plantation enterprise. And tobacco being a very labor-intensive crop, meant that there needed to be a lot of people working on, whether growing it, refining it, shipping it, what have you. And much of the labor force in the Chesapeake region during the colonial era was enslaved people of African descent, people who were born in Africa or descended from people born in Africa, and indentured Europeans. Okay. So those of you may remember, back from your like high school history days, indentured servitude is like a temporary form of enslavement that was mostly open to Europeans, and it sort of paid for their passage across, across the Atlantic for people born in England or Ireland, Scotland, and the idea being that you would work off that cost by enslaving yourself to somebody for a period of time, usually 5 to 7 years, after which you would be given some land and kind of a fresh start. Now, there wasn't much of a sense in the first couple decades of the Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina colonies. So say the first, maybe we'll say up to like the mid 17th century, the mid 1600s, there wasn't much codified into law about slavery and indentured servitude. So a lot of people of African descent who were brought to Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, sort of saw that indentured servitude going around for white people, for European descended people, and thought, they wanted to enter into some of those contracts. And many did. Many were able to convince their enslavers or their employers that they should be entitled to some of that and some land in repayment for the labor that they gave. And some were able to earn, gain land that way. Some people of African descent even bought enslaved people themselves or indentured white people, right? So there's a lot of instances of that. But as time wore on, and the Virginia elites kind of saw that they could really divide the labor force in order to enrich themselves, they gradually passed laws that made slavery permanent for people of African descent, inheritable through the mother, right? That was kind of a new like technology of slavery, the fact that somebody born to an enslaved person could also be enslaved. So inheritable through the mother, meaning if a woman of color, a Black woman, was free, their children would be free, even if they had an enslaved father, or vice versa. If a free man had a child with an enslaved woman, that child would be enslaved. That was kind of a law developed in the 1670s and 80s in Virginia and Maryland. And also laws that made enslaved people property, right? Rated people as real estate. That came along in the 1680s. That helped create the kind of slavery that we were taught, what we call chattel slavery, or property in people. That was really developed in this Chesapeake region and then radiated to the other regions of the country at that time. The other major area where slavery developed would be what's known as the Low Country, or what we're talking about here is kind of like the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, and that immediate coastal vicinity there. Now, the first Europeans who colonized that area came from Barbados, right? And Barbados was sort of the sugar capital of the British Empire, right? That they tried to make Jamaica the capital, but there was a lot of resistance in Jamaica. So Barbados really is one of the kind of the sugar capital of the British Empire, and Barbados is not a very big island. So after a few generations, British people had to seek land elsewhere. So what they did was they found land here and found a crop that grew well here, and that was rice in the Low Country. And they brought a particularly brutal form of slavery from the Caribbean with them. And when I say particularly brutal, what I mean is that life expectancy for enslaved people in the Caribbean was about 7 years for the most part. Right? Think about that for a second, what that means, right? 7 years. It's not that they're having children who are not living to 7 years old. It's the fact that kidnapped victims are being brought there and were worked to death by 7 years on average. Okay, so that particularly brutal form of slavery came right into South Carolina and Georgia, in the Sea Islands. And in a really devastatingly ironic twist, Georgia was actually founded as a free labor colony. It was dedicated to colonizing free white people and for like white family farms. However, because slavery was so lucrative and made enslavers so much money, by within 5 years, Georgia had done away with that law and allowed slavery. Now, if the Low Country and the Chesapeake region was developed specifically as money-making enterprises, New England, as a lot of us know, was not necessarily only settled for money-making enterprises. It was settled by religious pilgrims, right? Of course, money-making was part of the whole deal, but really, it's founded by people, who we call the Puritans, right? These really, really conservative Calvinists who, wanted to create, a Boston, the city on the hill, right? But anyway, so slavery came right along with the Pilgrims to New England. And actually, in fact, remember how I said in the Chesapeake region, it wasn't until the mid 17th century where, these kind of the separation between black and white and enslavement versus indenture started really being codified into law. So actually, Massachusetts was the first, right, of the New England, or I should say of the British North American colonies to actually codify slavery into law. And of course, as religious pilgrims, what they did was they found their justification for slavery in the Bible, and specifically they based it on Leviticus chapter 25 verses 44 to 46, which you can see in this quote. There shall never, and I should say this was part of the group of laws they passed in 1641 called the Body of Liberties, right? Again, one of those devastatingly ironic titles. Right. And what they said was, there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. And these shall have all the liberties and Christian usages, which the law of God established in Israel concerning such persons does morally require. This exempts none from servitude who shall be judged thereto by authority, right? And actually that last part kind of presages the 13th Amendment, right, which says, slavery is abolished, with the exception of being duly convicted of a crime, right? But anyway, this is the rationale for slavery, right? It's right there in the Bible that number one, if the Puritans saw themselves as the kind of ancestors or this generation of Israelites, God gave them the authority to enslave strangers among them, right? And of course, they lived among indigenous people, right? And Africans who were brought there, they would have considered strangers among them, right? And also there's the second justification, which was a justification used really early on in the 14 and 1500s when Europeans started enslaving Africans in huge numbers, that they were captives in wars, right? They were prisoners of war taken in warfare on the African continent and therefore liable to be traded as chattel, right? So you get that kind of the whole rationale kind of comes together almost in Massachusetts, right? 1641. It's the first of the British North American colonies to codify into law. One important thing to note about slavery in New England is that it was never a static institution, right? I think we often have this idea of slavery, kind of existing for 200 years as this institution in which enslaved people labored on like giant cotton plantations or sugar plantations. And it was that way for 200 years up until the Civil War, which actually isn't true. Slavery, like everything, kind of developed over time and refashioned itself over time. And that's kind of proven by the fact that especially in the 1740s to about the 1760s, there was a huge uptick in people trafficked from Africa. And that's the peak of New England slavery, so right around 1750 into 1755 or so. This is when you get the highest number of people trafficked from Africa and from the Caribbean to New England. Now, it should be noted, just in terms of numbers, I'm not really a numbers person, but I figured I know a lot of people are, so this helps set the scene a little bit. In terms of percentage of the population of New Englanders, enslaved people constituted about 3 to 4% at most time periods. Again, it fluctuated, but around most time periods, enslaved people constitute about 3 to 4% of the whole population of New England. So not a very big number, right? It seems at first blush anyway. But Rhode Island was sort of the capital of slavery in New England because by about 1750, up to about 10% of the population in Rhode Island was enslaved. Okay, so that's 1 out of every 10, right? It's about 1 to 3% elsewhere, about 2 to 3% in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and about maybe 1% or less in New Hampshire. And of course, there's 4 New England colonies, right? Because Maine is part of Massachusetts and Vermont, was not organized as an official colony yet. But so it might seem like a small number, right? But if you think about it this way, if 10% of, let's say in Rhode Island, 10% of the population is enslaved, right? That's 1 out of every 10 people. However, most families had only one, or enslaved 1 or 2 people. Most families who were enslavers enslaved 1 or 2 people, right? That 1 or 2 enslaved people is serving a whole family, right? So there's a huge number of people benefiting, right, from enslavement. So slavery is not just affecting 10% of the population, right? It's affecting a lot more of the population, even in those small areas, and in those areas where there's a small percentage, right? They're playing an outsized role in the larger economic sphere, and we'll talk about that kind of as we go. One other kind of major thing to note here is that for New England, slavery, or I should say enslaved people as part of the labor force, again, represented about 10% of it, right? So they were slavery was one, maybe you could put it this way, slavery is one of kind of a constellation of different forms of labor in New England, right? Now in the Southern United States, or in the Southern British North America, and then into the United States after the American Revolution, slavery was the central form of labor, right? Enslaved labor was central to the development of the economies in those areas. And then, of course, by 1860, slavery in the southern United States is central to the wealth of the entire country, which is why you fight a civil war in order to end it, But in New England, again, slavery is one of many different forms of labor. However, the business of slavery, the economic benefit that white New Englanders derived from slavery was far outweighed what we think of as like small numbers of enslaved people. Okay. First, New England was kind of one corner of what's known as maybe you remember this from taking history classes before, the triangle trade route, right, or the triangular trade, which is, there's a diagram of it right here. And as part of as one kind of corner of the triangle trade, slavery made white New Englanders a lot of money. So first of all, Rhode Island shipping merchants, especially people like the DeWolfs of Bristol, Rhode Island, the Browns of Providence, right? The Brown family, it's a descendant of the Brown family who trafficked and enslaved people, right? Who donated a lot of money and then turned Rhode Island College into Brown University, right? So it's right there. It's still right there, imprinted on Rhode Island's landscape, right? But shipping merchants, right, made a lot of money in trade for enslaved people. If you can see, I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but I'll trace it for you. Rum, which was distilled in New England from sugar grown in the Caribbean, was trafficked to Africa. And in a lot of areas on the West African coast, rum, guns, but especially rum was like currency, right? Like rum would be traded for enslaved people, right, on the coast of Africa, by either, European merchants, warring African nations, etc., would trade enslaved people. Now, most of them would come here to the Caribbean, but a lot either went from the Caribbean and whichever trafficked people were not offloaded in the Caribbean could be brought up to the New England area, or some voyages just went right back to New England and did kind of a straight line trade. So anyway, the New England shipping became central to the traffic in enslaved people across the Atlantic. And in fact, Rhode Island itself trafficked 60% of enslaved people to British North America, right? 60%, right? That's huge. That's a huge number. Boston banks grew up on financing a lot of these trading enterprises. They also grew up on financing a lot of the land that would be used for slavery, especially after the development of what was the Old Southwest, Alabama and Mississippi. Boston banks largely grew up on this trade, right? Insurance companies in Connecticut, right, are forming. Insurance, especially in the UK, became a hugely lucrative institution because, of course, enslaved people revolted on ships in huge numbers. So a lot of financiers demanded, insurance on voyages that would be trafficking in human beings, right? And insurance companies in Connecticut became central to this too, right? It's still, Hartford is still a center of the insurance industry today, right? It has its start right here. Yeah, so anyway, like I said, one corner of the triangle trade was rum distilled from slave, and also let's go back to that, right? The rum that was distilled in New England came from slave-grown sugar in the Caribbean, right? So again, it's not just slavery, enslaved people in New England, but it's New Englanders making a lot of money off of slavery in the Atlantic world. And the business of slavery continued long after slavery's end, right? Because as the region developed as kind of a farm, early in New England, the settlements were all clustered on the coast, and the coastwise trade was important. But as the population grew into the interior and farms became huge sectors of the economy in New England, it's New England made dairy, right? Cheese, butter, etc. Vegetables grown in New England, meat grown from butchered from livestock in New England would be shipped to the Caribbean, right, to feed the enslaved population, right? Straw hats made in rural New England that we represent here sometimes at the museum, right, are sent to the Caribbean for use by enslaved people. So again, New England is very much wrapped up in this. And then after the American Revolution and after the Cotton Revolution of about 1790s to the 1810s, when cotton becomes the chief export of the United States, northern factories that in the Industrial Revolution are fed by slave-grown cotton from the South. Right. So again, that's just to make sure we understand that point, that New England was very much involved, not just enslaved people here, but in the whole, Atlantic human trafficking ring. So I give you the broader context now, just to kind of zoom in a little bit. Of course, we at the museum here represent rural New England, and enslaved people, of course, lived in rural New England, and people were enslaved in rural New England. In the rural areas, what you see is enslaved people largely enslaved like on family farms, especially in Massachusetts. One or two people would be enslaved to help, around the house, around the farm, what have you. A huge plantation economy didn't really develop in rural New England, with the exception of Rhode Island, which I'll talk about in a second. But the rural slavery in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and northern New England never equaled the size or scope of the cotton plantation regime in the South. So when you think of like the plantation system, right, you think hundreds of people enslaved on hundreds of acres of cotton land or sugar country, what have you. But and I think that kind of plays into the mythology of slavery wasn't that bad here. But if you think about it, if you stop and you actually think about it, what you find is that enslaved people in rural New England faced extreme isolation. Right, there was almost nowhere to go. There was, unlike in more urban areas, there isn't, there aren't thriving Black communities in these areas. So it's a very, very isolating condition to be enslaved in rural New England, and there's a lot of despair. There's enslavers talking about the despair that they see in the people that they enslaved, right? So it's not any less bad. Again, I know I'm kind of hitting that point a lot, but I just want to make sure we're understanding that. Southern Rhode Island, however, did actually have a large scale plantation industry. There were huge farms in Southern Rhode Island, and I know people know New England think how can there possibly be regions in Rhode Island? It's a very small state, but there are. In South Carolina, Rhode Island, there were huge vegetable, turf, and other crops grown in a large scale plantation industry, in which enslaved people labored on plantations with 25, 50, even more enslaved people. And actually what you find in Southern Rhode Island, it's actually very much akin to what develops in South Carolina, right? Because in South Carolina, enslavers who didn't want to live in those kind of mosquito infested rice paddies with the people that they enslaved, developed kind of an aristocratic society in Charleston, South Carolina. And this kind of a similar thing happens in Newport, right? Where large scale enslavers actually own, mansions, right? In Newport, it's where, most of those mansions aren't there from this time, but it's where that idea of Newport as an aristocratic area comes from, right? So that's kind of the idea of rural slavery. Again, most of the time it's enslaved people being forced to work on farms, kind of a lot of times right next to the person who's enslaving them, right? Which also presents itself with a host of dangers, right? but it is, with the exception of Southern Rhode Island, there isn't a huge, large scale plantation industry that develops. The most common form of slavery in New England is what historians call like urban slavery, or slavery in towns and cities, especially along the coast, right? So the biggest towns and cities across New England, of course, are on the coasts. It's a very maritime driven society. So in these towns and cities, there was a multitude of different ways people lived as enslaved people. Many were enslaved in households, okay, which again, just to kind of do some mythology busting, a lot of I think a lot of the conception we have of slavery is that it's worse to work out in a field than it is to work in a home, which isn't necessarily true, because if you are working in your enslaver's home, first of all, again, you are in close proximity with your enslaver, which presents itself with a lot of different interactions, which can be very dangerous, right? You're forced to always be on, right? There's very little break time for enslaved people, very little time to themselves, right? If you're enslaved right next to the person who's enslaving you, right? They were often forced to sleep in their enslaver's home, right? A lot of times they would be on call at all hours of the night. If an enslaver needed something or wanted something to be done at night, enslaved person had to get up and do it, right? A lot of times they had to sleep in garrets, attics, and basements, right? If you think about it, think of New England weather, right? Attics get brutally hot in the summer, brutally cold in the winter, right? So it's not a pleasurable, existence, right? They're forced to eat in kitchens, right? They're forced to, they're at the mercy of their enslavers as to what their diet could be, right? They're not able to eat at tables, right? They're often forced to eat by themselves. Even, mothers and children, I should say parents and children, forced to eat when they could, right? Because they were always on, right? So very little time really to develop family bonds. Enslavement in the urban areas a lot of it's tied to the region's economy, right? So in maritime areas, most enslaved people would be employed in maritime industry, right? A lot of people were enslaved to ship captains. Some people who were enslaved in coastal cities were rented out to ship captains by their enslavers so that they could, earn some money for their enslaver, right? Maritime enslavement also offered some avenues for escape. I should say, by the way, just to backtrack for a sec, I have pictures here that I haven't explained. But the picture on the top right here is the Royal House in Boston, in which people were enslaved and had to live in these areas here. Like I said, maritime enslavement often offered avenues for escape, right? If you could, going from port to port, if you could make yourself disappear, you can make yourself disappear on a different ship, right? So actually a lot of escapes were due to maritime slavery, right? Possibly the most famous person who escaped slavery would be Frederick Douglass, right? He escaped by forging seamen's protection papers, right? So he knew the maritime industry well and knew that could afford him, knew how that industry worked. Another person on the bottom right here was Alada Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vasa, who was one of the first people, formerly enslaved people to write his autobiography, and became heavily involved in the British abolitionist movement in the early late 1700s, early 1800s. He was enslaved to a ship captain, and he was able to earn his freedom that way. Some enslaved people who were enslaved in maritime industries, actually just shipboard life itself, right, offered some avenues for like upward mobility, right? Because if you're on a ship confined on the open sea, right, if you have an ability, that ability is going to be used, right? So a lot of enslaved people were able to use their seafaring skills to rise in ranks aboard ships, right? It's very hierarchical um, society, right, aboard ships. Some were expert navigators and became the pilots of ships. Some even became captains, right? If you're the pilot of the ship, you're the boss, right? You're steering it. You're saying exactly what's going to happen with the sails and where it's going to go, right? So there are actually like enslaved people who became, pilots and temporary captains aboard ships, right? So it's kind of an avenue for upward mobility for some. Again, whatever the area of the economy was, you found enslaved people. Many worked in, say, workshops or offices even. Right here at the museum, we have the McClellan Law Office from Connecticut, right? John McClellan enslaved a young girl named Cleona, right? So you find enslaved people wherever, in every occupation. Many enslaved people acquired marketable skills, right? And these skills could also be avenues for freedom. I saw when I teach this, I often have students read this advertisement taken out in a North Kingstown, Rhode Island newspaper, which requests that the public be on the lookout for this person who escaped slavery. He was an anchor maker, right? So he was, of course, had a very important skill to the economy, and most likely was able to gain resources enough to use that skill to escape, but also wherever he escaped to, he would have a job prospect, right? So we learn a lot through these runaway ads, and like I said, one of the things is we understand that these could be skills that were marketable, which could be avenues for freedom. There are cases of enslaved people like Caesar Linden, who was enslaved to a really prominent businessman in Newport, Rhode Island, and his enslaver kind of saw in him, a deep intellect, and he became a prominent bookkeeper for this person. And his enslaver entrusted him actually to go out and go on, like, what we might call like sales calls, right? Like, and go and run errands, make sales, close deals, etc. Right? So these could be avenues for freedom as well. Also, what you find in a lot of the coastal communities, you find enslaved writers, right? And a lot of these writers became founders of an African American literary tradition, right? So one of the first people to write his autobiography was an enslaved person from Boston named Britton Hannon, right? Venture Smith, who was enslaved in Connecticut, right, writes his autobiography. Phyllis Wheatley, one of the most famous writers, who's pictured right here. One of the most famous poets, like not just most famous Black poets, one of the most famous poets of the 1700s, was enslaved as a young girl in Boston, right? And again, what you find is the beginning of what we again, like I have on here an African American literary tradition, but you have specifically like African inspired poetry, right? Phyllis Wheatley most likely had learned. Phyllis Wheatley was kidnapped when she was about 6 years old from Africa, and she had already like learned to write, right? It wasn't like her enslaver taught her how to write and she became a good poet because she was taught that way, right? No, she learned how to write in Africa. People, African Americans writing their autobiographies kind of turns into one of the most popular forms of literature called the slave narrative, right, in the 1840s and 50s, which were a huge tool for the abolitionists to spread the movement to end slavery. Another important aspect of life for enslaved New Englanders is called Negro election days. And I want to just make a note on the terminology. The term Negro, of course, is really no longer used today. The term itself was kind of done away with by Black activists during the Black Power movement in the late 1960s, early 70s. They determined that Negro was kind of a colonial appellation and decided to take on the term Black and empower that term Black, right, with power and dignity, right, where it had been denigrated for so long. However, a lot of people who are trying to bring this tradition back, Negro Election Day, are saying they want to use this term Negro. So I'm going to follow their lead and sort of call it Negro Election Day. As you can see actually here pictured, they're doing Negro Election Days in Salem, right? Salem, Massachusetts, where Negro elections were popular in the colonial era. This is an advertisement, this picture is an advertisement for one that's actually going to occur in a few weeks in Salem. And what Negro Election Days were, they were celebrations usually in early to mid-summer in which the Black community in a city or in a region, like in Rhode Island, there were Negro elections in Warwick, Rhode Island, where people would come from Newport and Providence to kind of all meet together. They would come together, and one of the biggest, and they would basically have like sometimes multi-day, sometimes one day major celebration, a feast. They would dress in their fanciest clothes. Sometimes they would get their enslavers to give them fancy clothes. Sometimes they had them themselves. One of the biggest kind of most central aspects of the celebration was electing governors or kings, depending. And it's interesting. It depended on the colony. So Rhode Island and Massachusetts were kind of founded and had royal governors, whereas the crown colonies, like New York, would have a king, a Black or a Negro king elected. So these were celebrations, feasts, and they were actually like really important to creating, what we might consider an African American culture in the North, right? At these events, the elected kings, governors, officers were often empowered to settle disputes. Among Black families, among people that they really didn't want, kind of white people to be settling for them, right? Because that could sometimes endanger violence, endanger maybe the person, maybe a person could be sold away from the area. So it was really kind of an internal way to settle disputes, but also to kind of form and reform bonds of kinship and friendship, right? It's, again, I told you, it's a very isolating life that a lot of enslaved people were forced to lead, but these days were real celebrations, and especially, like I said, affirmations of humanity, right? Some scholars kind of view these as like, white enslavers allowing some time for people to, to blow off steam or whatever. But in reality, it's really, it's really, an affirmation of culture, an affirmation of humanity. Now, these lasted well into the 19th century in some areas, but they kind of faded as greater political participation and desegregation, and the anti-slavery movement became prioritized by a lot of Black leaders. So that's slavery in New England, and I think it's equally important to talk about the end of slavery in New England, and it happens during the time of the American Revolution, right? And especially the Revolutionary War, right? So during the Revolutionary War, as you probably know, especially if you're from around here, the rhetoric of liberty, right? Liberty radiated throughout the North. And that idea was not lost on enslaved people, right? Americans, white Americans were talking about, oh, we're enslaved by the British because we're not represented in Parliament, right? And enslaved people start writing petitions saying, no, listen, you're talking about, you don't want to be enslaved. Like, look what you're doing here, right? So a lot of that rhetoric of liberty generated freedom petitions by enslaved people. There are many famous examples of them in Boston, in Providence, really everywhere. During the American Revolution, during the war itself, Black men served proportionally, proportion to the population. Listen to this, right? Listen to this, I should say. I know I talk really fast. I'm a Rhode Islander. Black men served in proportionately greater numbers and for longer terms than white men in the Continental Army, right? Again, proportionately greater to the population. but longer terms. Often enslaved people or free Black people would sign up for like the duration of the war or a number of years. Most white men would enlist for, 6-month enlistments or, a year, 18 months, something like that. But, on average, Black men enlisted for longer terms. And especially because by the time quotas were not being filled by white men, colonial governments started, kind of acceding to Black men's demands that they be allowed to fight too, of course, in exchange for freedom, right? So, that alone, first of all, knocks out one of the ideological pillars of slavery that supposed Black people's inferiority, right? If you're willing to fight and die for your freedom, you deserve your freedom, right? And also just the chaos of war provides a lot of avenues for escape, right? The British Army comes into town, there's a lot of people who leave, enslaved people included, right? So slavery really goes like it really has lost like a lot of its support through the revolution, again, through the rhetoric of liberty, people fighting in the war and people just escaping the chaos of war. And the official end of slavery comes in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, really sort of quickly, relatively quickly. In Massachusetts, the court cases of Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mum Bet, and Quock Walker in 1781, 1783, basically makes slavery illegal in Massachusetts, right? Elizabeth Freeman is pictured here on the bottom right, sued for her freedom based on the fact that the newly drafted Massachusetts state constitution, written by largely John Adams in 1780, the first clause in that is all men are born free and equal. And so, Freeman wins her freedom based on that. And in the case of Quock Walker, an enslaved man, he wasn't really suing for his freedom, but his enslaver was trying to get him back. And the judge in that case said that slavery was incompatible with the Massachusetts Constitution, so the jury could not find that Quock Walker was enslaved, right? And so we get the census that it really ends quickly there. And by the 1790 census, the first census taken in the United States, no enslaved people are counted in Massachusetts, actually. However, that doesn't mean that slavery hasn't existed. That just means they're not in the census. And the census in those times are not the most reliable source of information often. In New Hampshire stopped taxing enslaved people as property in 1789. So that a lot of New Hampshire historians point to as the end of slavery. However, there were some people who remained enslaved right into the 19th century, and it wasn't even formally abolished in New Hampshire through their state legislature until 1857. Okay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, it was a little bit different. It was emancipation was enacted gradually, and actually, Rhode Island and Connecticut passed the law really at the same time, and both said that all people born to enslaved mothers after March 1st, 1784 would be temporarily enslaved. Okay, in Connecticut, it was until the age of 25, and then later changed to 21. In Rhode Island, women who gave birth to girls, those girls would be enslaved until 18 and boys until 21. Okay, so it didn't end quickly. However, it lasted a really long time. There were still enslaved people counted in the census in Rhode Island, I know, in 1840, right? So elderly, but still enslaved, right? So it didn't free anybody right away, and it didn't free actually anybody really until 21 years later. However, very few people remained enslaved because enslaved people did find that they could leave and the state would not use its apparatus to recapture people. And there was a huge depression, economic depression in the late 1780s in really across the country. And there was not many resources to recapture enslaved people. So enslaved people really took it upon themselves to end slavery much quicker than the law. And if we're rounding out New England, of course, Maine is part of Massachusetts until 1820. It's the Maine district. Vermont had outlawed slavery by its Constitution of 1777. And I know we're kind of running out of time here. But I just want to say one more thing, just as a kind of coda. This Black life after slavery was very much affected by slavery. There were discriminatory laws that remained on the books from slavery. For instance, in Rhode Island, there were laws on the books that said that indigenous or Black people could not gain business licenses to sell alcohol or other things in public spaces and on public conveyances. Jim Crow was invented right here, right? And actually the person pictured here is David Ruggles. He was one of the first people to use the term Jim Crow, right? We associate it with, I think, the South and in the years between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. However, it was invented here, right? Segregation on, say, railroad cars, right? On stagecoaches, in theaters, was invented right here, right? There wasn't segregation during slavery because it was assumed that enslaved people going to these things were with their enslavers, right? So, but segregation was kind of invented in the wake of slavery. Many enslaved people, especially if they lived in rural areas already, settled where they were and owned land and farmed. There's in almost every town in rural Massachusetts, you see people of color, right, living and owning land and farming, right? One of the most famous examples of somebody who remained in an urban area, he wasn't enslaved himself, but is Guy Scott, who was living in Sturbridge in the 1830s. He did a few jobs and then became a lead miner and then rose to become a foreman at his mine, right? So even though there was this harsh discrimination, there were some people who were lucky enough or able to gain wealth for them and their generations after them. Many Black New Englanders moved to urban areas. A lot of people who were enslaved, especially in, like, remember I said, Southern Rhode Island, moved to areas like Providence and Newport, where they could reconstitute families and friendships. And it's really in New England cities and towns that community institutions like Black churches develop. And community leadership comes out of these places like churches or barbershops, right? A lot of community leaders by the 1820s and 30s were artisans, laborers, and barbers, excuse me. And it's really those people who form the kind of hardcore of the abolitionist movement. And it's Black New Englanders, Black community leaders who form that first hardcore of the abolitionist movement going forward, really just a generation after slavery had largely ended in New England. Okay. So that's all I've got. This is, I will say we could, to revisit some of the main takeaways, this is just a carbon copy of the main takeaway slide. I hope I've hit these points and made these clear, but I am happy to hang out for as long as people want to answer questions, to chat. Yeah. So Brittany.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was a fascinating presentation. So we do have a few questions.
Okay, awesome.
So our first question, would you like to read it or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I can see. I'll start right from the beginning here. So Kelly McCreevy, Connecticut elected Black governors to the mid 1850s. Is this an example of that? Yeah. It went out of favor in most places, but yeah, I know especially I know Hartford, the Negro election was a community institution that remained. Yeah, in a lot of different areas, it went out by the 1830s, like I said, in order to because Black leaders kind of more focused on integrating into American society and trying to win the right to vote. Especially and end discrimination, right? So yeah, absolutely, that is exactly what I was referring to. Tom Morehouse says, what primary sources do we have in our collections and library reflecting 1790 to 1840 slave ownership in Sturbridge area? That's really interesting. I haven't mined the collections for for people who continue to own enslaved people, I'd imagine it's very sparse, especially because, like I said, enslaved people were not counted on the census. So if there were people who are continuing to be enslaved in this area, very little record, enslavers wouldn't want to leave records of that, right? If that makes sense. So that's a great question. I'm not sure, but I'd love to delve into it, a little bit more. So yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, Kelly. Yeah, so this is Kelly McCreevy then said, Black governors, many are buried in the burying ground in Hartford. Right. It continued a lot longer in Hartford than in other areas. And if I may, I'm going to go back to this slide. And actually, this picture on the right is from the Hartford Negro. It's a later depiction, but it's a depiction of the Negro election in Hartford. So yeah, there's that. Thank you, Kelly. Elaine says, how long did the kingship or Black governor reign? That's a great question. I love these questions about this thing in particular, because it's a really important part of life for enslaved people in this era. So, I hate to give the answer, it varied, but it did vary. A lot of times, the elections would typically happen yearly. So someone would, kind of like we do elections, today, like someone would be elected and then try to get reelected. A lot of times, I should say too that in some areas, there's been some evidence that's been found that actually people who are elected kings or governors often were actually from like royal families in Africa, in areas where they were kidnapped. Right. So especially if there were other people from that area who were enslaved in that area, there might be a level of, of reverence just anyway for those people. Right. So yeah, so it did vary. They were typically yearly. So the reign would probably be as long as they could keep the support of the community. Yeah. Mel says, how long were natives enslaved and in which states, and when did their enslavement actually end? That's a great question. And if I was doing a longer version of this, I would have talked much more about indigenous people being enslaved, because they were actually, when Europeans first tried to colonize any area, the first people they tried to enslave were indigenous people, right? Now, it was very difficult they very often found it difficult, especially, I'll keep it to New England so I don't go off, because there's a lot of different aspects of it to it. In the South, there was an unfortunately robust trade in indigenous slavery with other indigenous groups and with other countries. In New England, it's really hard to enslave indigenous people here because they have such vast connections in the interior. They know the land, right? They can get away when need be, right? So what you find is, first, of course, again, that was the first thing they tried to do. And we know that for a lot of different reasons. One is somebody I'm sure everybody has heard of, especially if you went to school in New England, of Squanto, right? The indigenous man who as the story goes, or as the legend goes, taught the colonists how to grow crops and was a really big help, and everybody loved him. Squanto was actually enslaved early on, and he was taken in the early 1600s, and he was taken to Europe, where he learned English. And he came back, and when he came back after the Great Death, right? The a huge epidemic that swept indigenous areas in Massachusetts from 1617 to 1619, and his entire community was gone, right? So what you have is this person who was enslaved but who knows the language, right? So he really doesn't have much of a choice other than to make it a survival strategy to kind of help colonists out, and kind of be a go-between between other indigenous groups and the colonists in Massachusetts. After the Pequot War in the 1630s, many Pequots were enslaved. And after King Philip's War in the 1675, a lot of, different groups in the area, Mohegan, Narragansett, Wampanoag, people were enslaved. But what colonists did then, because they knew that they couldn't really keep them enslaved here, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but a lot of cases, they would ship indigenous people to other areas, where they could, be held in captivity. Actually, there's a lot of people. There's Narragansett descendants in Bermuda, right? From that kind of harken back to this. But it really was an important part of slavery in New England. Again, if this was a longer thing, I'd talk a lot more about it. But yeah, you're right. So it never, and I should say, it never really ended here either, too, because indigenous people were often forced into like indenture contracts, especially indigenous children were often forced into indentured contracts, and then those contracts would not be honored. Right, the end of the indenture would not be honored by the person who indentured them, right? And indigenous people were kept often in some of these, I don't want to say in conditions that resembled slavery, because often they were no different from slavery. But that really continued, really as long as slavery did in New England. Thank you for that question. Beth says, did Black and white men serve in the same units in the Revolutionary War? Were Black men listed by name in the rolls? I'm going to answer your second question first, Beth, and say yes. And actually, there's a really good resource. There's like a 1,000-page book where this person found like every person who enlisted, or every Black person who enlisted in the Revolutionary War, or not every, because you never say every, but most. Especially in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And this picture I have here on the top right is a reenactment of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. So the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was open to Black and indigenous soldiers, right? It was again, Black men were clamoring to be able to serve in the war in exchange for freedom, and the Rhode Island General Assembly finally allowed them to, and I believe it was 1778. It could be 1777, but 1778 is in my mind. But the regiment itself, I believe, was there were white men and men of color in the regiment. However, in certain groups, and I don't know the military lingo, but in certain groups, it would be mostly, if not all, soldiers of color. However, there were white men in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Early on, especially though, in the early militias, like in Bunker Hill and in Lexington and Concord, where Black men served, they served right alongside shoulder to soldier. Oh man, tongue twister. Shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers, right? In those militia units, definitely. So again, I hate to give the answer, it's complicated, but yeah, it was. I mean, it's at times they would, but in some of the regiments developed by state legislatures, they would try at the best they could to segregate those units. Larry says, you mentioned at the beginning that the Pilgrims were connected to slavery. Could you be more specific about that? Yeah, I mean they enslaved people. Is really what it was, right? I wish I could, let me just think for like 2 seconds while I sip this water. Yeah, I mean, other than the fact that they were enslavers and that they were, heavily involved in especially in Boston, the way the economy of the region developed, they were very heavily involved in slavery itself. Yeah, I wish what I'm going to do. So I wish I could be more specific, or I wish I could ask you for more specificity of that. But what I can do is, Brittany, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to offer people my email. You can feel free to email me a question if I'm not able to get to it.
I will share your email in the chat box.
Tonight. Yeah, thank you. So if you do have a specific, who was that? That was Larry. Yeah, Larry. So if you want to email me like a more specific, I'm happy to help. All right. Katarzyna, I hope I'm saying your name right. Did any of the historical homes at OSV have slaves or formerly enslaved people? Yes, the law office, we know for a fact, had, John McClellan, the McClellan Law Office, he enslaved a young girl named Cleona, and actually, most likely entered into an illegal arrangement with her because she may have been born after March 1st of 1784, which means she would not have been enslaved for life, like he thought she would have been. So there, yes. As for some of the other properties, that's a great question. I'm not entirely sure. There has been a lot of stuff done in the past, and I should say I am new here. I've been here 6 months, so I haven't had time to read all of the research that's been done on, like, the Freeman family, or the Fitch house, or even the towns, really, from the Salem townhouse. But yeah, that's going to be I'll have to get back to you on that. But that's a very good question, and thank you for asking. Betsy says, sorry about that. The governor of the African. Okay. Yeah.
We also have a couple questions in the comments.
Okay,
can you see them? I can read them for you too if you want. It's easier.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Because they're kind of hard to find.
Thanks, Brittany.
So, of the families who lived or owned the houses on display at OSV, oh yeah, so that one we just answered, never mind. And then this other question was, do you have anything to say about Vermont, slavery in Vermont, or anything that might have occurred in Vermont?
Yeah, I haven't done a ton of research in Vermont, but what I can say is, slavery existed everywhere. So it very clearly existed in Vermont. Vermont was kind of a border region, between the kind of French colonists and French Canada, and Quebec, in the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee region of upstate New York into Ontario and New England. It was kind of a confluence of all these different areas, and there was especially a lot of indigenous slavery that occurred in that area. So there's no doubt that on Vermont soil slavery existed. And I should say, just the fact that it was outlawed by its constitution probably means that was recognition that it existed there. It was outlawed by the Constitution of 1777. Now, of course, 1777, it's not really a state yet. It's not officially part of the United States. It's the 14th colony, as some like to say. But so it really it was the first recognized state constitution to explicitly outlaw slavery. Once that constitution was adopted when it became a state in Vermonters out there, 1791, 92, something like that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, CJ. I think that is all the questions we have.
All right.
All right. So thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderful. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. If the viewers did not catch the entire program or they would like to share it, as I said before, there was a recording of the webinar that will be shared to all our members in the following week, and it will also be on YouTube. So thank you all again for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you all for having me, and thank you, Brittany.
No problem. Have a good night.